Welcome everyone to our fifth in a series of foster care and adoption virtual information events as we continue to have experts join us to answer your questions about becoming a foster or adoptive parent. Jeannie Hollingshead is our Director of Foster Care and Adoption, and she'll be helping to moderate questions through the Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Kelly Evans serves as the UP Center's Director of Community-Based Programs, a role that administers the agency's community-based services program that provides intensive in-home services, mental health skill building services, behavior aid, and supervised visitation. She began her career with the UP Center in 2001, and she is a licensed clinical social worker and a certified sex offender treatment provider. Thank you for joining us, Kelly.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
We're excited to have you. As we begin, would you please share a little bit about your story, about your experience working with families in the foster care system?
Yes, I came to the UP Center in 2001, and 6 months after coming, I was given the job of directing our treatment foster care program, and I did that for 20 years. I've been with the UP Center 20 years, so I just transitioned to my new role last year. So I do have quite a bit of experience in foster care. I was involved with our state associations, both Foster Family Treatment Association and the Virginia Association of Licensed Child Placing Agencies. So I have quite a bit of experience. I've also provided quite a bit of treatment to foster families, kids, and parents.
It's quite a bit of experience, huh?
Yeah.
So we have some questions for you to help our audience understand more about your experience and our topic for today. What do developmentally appropriate sexual behaviors look like, and when do behaviors rise to the level of becoming problematic?
Okay, well, that's a really detailed question. Lots of information I can provide on that. The best way I thought was I would share my screen, a PowerPoint with some information for people to look at. So I'm going to do that now.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I did it the wrong way. You got to share screen and then here we go. All right, so I'm going to start the slideshow from the beginning. Okay, so when we talk about the range of sexual behavior in children, there is quite a bit of a range. And one thing I think I've noticed that is a lot of parents, whether they're foster parents or biological parents or adoptive parents, is they sometimes forget that sexual behavior is normal in children, that we are going to see that regardless of whether they have trauma, whether they've had anything bad happen to them, or whether they've seen anything bad, that is just part of normal development in children. So what looks normal? What's normal and expected? Autostimulation and masturbation, either in public and private spaces, depending on the stage of development. When you're working with the younger kids, I would say like maybe 6 and under, they don't really understand about privacy unless you teach it to them. So they may do this in public, in private, anywhere. Kids older, that are like 7 and up, they typically are going to be doing it in private because they understand, they've learned some societal norms about this type of behavior, and they typically will do it in private. Kissing, hugging, peeking, touching peers, those are all normal and expected behaviors. Exposing genitals, I'm going to show you yours, you show me mine. Mooning kids, those can be part of normal sexual play. The big thing is to understand the motivation behind the behavior, and it's information seeking. So they're just kind of wanting to see what people are going to say. What's going to happen? What is someone going to do if I do this? That's part of the motivation behind the behavior. There's no coercion or force involved. Typically, it's a lot of laughing going on, humor. It's like a joke. These kids having expected sexual play isn't something that they're ashamed of because they're really not really understanding it, and it's spontaneous. Typically when they get caught, there's some embarrassment, right? And then you set the limit and you say, okay, we don't touch ourselves in public. We don't show our breasts to our peers. We don't take our pants down. You know, we don't do these things. And typically when you set limits with kids, normal and expected sexual play can be contained. So we move on to the next slide. So now we move into another category where it's called sexually reactive behavior. So something has happened to the child. It could be sexual or it could be non-sexual. It could be just some trauma. And they have found a way to kind of express themselves through their sexual behavior. Compulsively touching self or others. And when I say compulsive, I mean you've given them some warnings and some boundaries to stop, and they're not able to. You know, they're not able to stop. They do a lot of imitating adult sexual behavior. Some of that is because they've seen adults have sex or they've been exposed to pornography, but they do things like when you have a 3-year-old that's trying to come from behind another child and, you know, look like they're trying to have sex with them, that may be an indication that they've seen that, because that's not a typical behavior that you would see in a child that age. That's not normal sexual play. That's imitating adult behavior. Lots of sexual talk you'll see, like kids talking about sex and using a lot of slang words for sex at a young age. That's an indication that there's been some type of exposure there. Inappropriate touching adults, like sitting on the lap and touching the breasts of adults, trying to touch the private parts of an adult, is something that can be reactive behavior. Seductive behavior, like when you think kids are like asking for it or trying to mimic maybe some videos or some pornography that they've seen and being seductive, that can be a reactive behavior. Typically when you talk with these children, the motivation behind the behavior is going to be somewhat of loneliness, isolation. There could be some anger when they really start talking about the behavior because they don't understand what has happened to them and how that impacts how they're behaving. Because these are kids under 12 and they can be just very confused about what's going on. A lot of times they're reliving a trauma response. You know, this is something that they've seen that's happened to them. They've witnessed someone doing it to somebody else. So they're reliving their trauma and their abuse through their sexual behavior. Oftentimes the trauma is ongoing or recent. It's recent trauma, although it can be trauma that's happened before, but typically it can happen while the child is being traumatized. When they get caught, typically there's a lot of shame involved in getting caught when they've tried to sexually touch someone else or sexually touch an adult. They feel shame when they get caught. Okay. They also acknowledge that it needs to stop, but they might tell you, I can't. Like, I've worked with younger kids where they got a lot of self-soothing from masturbating, and when you try to tell them that, well, you can't do that at school, you can't do that while you sit at your desk, you can't do that at dinner table, this is for private in your bedroom, they say, I don't know how to stop doing it, because I feel an itch and I want to touch it, and they do. So that's an indication that there is some reaction to some sexual contact. Extensive mutual behavior is a category where you have kids that are typically the same age. They could be siblings, they could be cousins, they could be foster siblings, peers, but they're engaging in this behavior together. Precocious sexual behavior such as oral sex or sexual intercourse, sexual contact with multiple peer-age children, group sexual behavior where there's more than 2 people and they're engaging in sexual behavior together, persuasion without force, difficult to identify the victim from the offender in the situation. This can happen a lot of times when there's sibling sexual behavior together where they're exploring. Maybe there's been trauma in the family, maybe there hasn't, but they're doing some exploration and there's a lot of curiosity. And you're not really sure. There's a 1-year age difference between them, but you're not really sure who is the victim or offender, because they both agreed to do it. The motivation behind the behavior is typically loneliness and fear, and they use this situation to decrease neediness and make life seem more tolerable, aka self-soothing. A lot of sexual behavior is soothing behavior to kids because it does make you feel good in some ways physically. There typically is no shame or anxiety when caught, and they really don't want to stop. They don't see a need to stop. I'm not hurting anybody. You know, she's 10, I'm 10, what's wrong? Why can't we do this? They don't understand that at 10, you should not be engaging in sexual behavior. Kids in this category are really high risk for victimization. They may be demonstrating some sexual behavior that is mutual with another peer, but they're very, very vulnerable to being at risk of victimization by an older peer or an adult, because they sense that they see that the child is sexual and they know that they're vulnerable, so that they can be a person that they could target. Then we move into kids that have problematic sexual behavior. This means that they have a problem that is diagnosable and that they need treatment for it. These kids look a little different from the kids that we saw before. Typically, the behavior is aggressive and that there was coercion or force used. And when I say coercion, it doesn't mean there was some physical aggression, but they could bribe them. They could threaten them and say, if you don't do this, I'm going to tell, or I'm going to make up a lie about you. So you really have to kind of dig down about the aggressiveness of the behavior. And it's not just physical aggressiveness, it can be verbal. Typically, they have a preoccupation with sex. There's a lot of sexualization of things they're non-sexual, and they sexualize people and things, making comments. A lot of parents I've heard say, well, they make comments like when something comes on the TV and, you know, they see a woman, the first thing they say is, oh, look at her boobs, instead of saying, wow, you know, that lotion looks like it might smell good. You know, their first inclination is to go to the sexual content. Typically, there's more than 2 years age difference in victims. Often there's been physical trauma that accompanies the sexual acting out. The motivation behind these behaviors is multifaceted. It can be used to decrease lots of negative feelings like anger and loneliness, abandonment, trauma response, a lot of what we call revenge fantasy, which is a typical scenario when you're working with siblings, is they, you know, an older sibling sexually acts out on a younger sibling because they were born, because they came into their life and they distracted the parents from, from having to deal with this younger child. Now they can't attend to the older child, and there are lots of feelings of jealousy. Family dynamics get created of the good child and the bad child, and then a lot of times they act out as a result of that. And there could be some compulsive sexual drive. Typically, the behavior is denied when it's caught. They blame others, and they really can't stop without some significant intervention. So that's some information on sexual behavior. I know it's a lot. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't see any questions coming through about those specifically. So is there generally an age when you might start to see some of this problematic behavior?
I think there's no like one age that you could say. The youngest kid that I provided treatment to that did have a sexual behavior problem was 5. And that's young. And I know some people get surprised, but you can have sexual aggression in children that young. Some sexual behaviors you can see as soon as kids can kind of move. I mean, I've had a parent say, well, my 2-year-old, she's touching herself. Well, yeah, she learned that. She explored her body. Just like she can touch her elbow, she can also touch her vagina. So it can happen at any age.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What should foster parents know about youth with some of these problematic sexual behaviors?
I did not talk about sexual behaviors in adolescence. I forgot I had the slide. Do you want me to mention that real quick?
Go right ahead.
Okay, sorry, I forgot I put one in there. A lot of people are always worried about the younger kids, but sexual behavior in adolescence it's there. And it's about curiosity and love and peer acceptance. And, experimentation typically happens between 13 to 17. Intimate relationships are typically short-term. A lot of kids do have more longer-term relationships, but short-term relationships is kind of normal. Behaviors are motivated by hormone surge in the social environment. And normal behaviors can range from consensual kissing, touching genitals, oral, vaginal, and anal sex of age appropriate. So, what do foster parents need to know about potentially considering having a child join their family that has a problematic sexual behavior already identified, or there have been some observations of some sexual behaviors? So what should they know? That children, and I put PSB through my presentation, it stands for problematic sexual behavior. 12 years and older and young, they're different than the younger kids. So teens are way different than the younger kids, and they're not the same, and we shouldn't consider them the same. So developmental stages, the behaviors, the motivation, the influences, internal and external forces, very diverse. Assessment and treatment of these populations are different, and they vary wildly. It's important to understand there's also specialized populations within children who have sexual behavior problems. You need certain skill set to work with children that have intellectual disabilities because the way that the information is delivered is different. Children on the spectrum with autism, I've worked with quite a few kids on the spectrum because their behaviors are misinterpreted as sexual aggression when they're not. So you really need to understand autism spectrum disorders to work with this population, to know, is the behavior a function of their autism, or is it a function of a sexual behavior problem? Sibling incest, reunification, and reconciliation is another specialty, and it happens to be my specialty. I do a lot of reconciliation and reunification work with sibling incest. So those are some other things. I think there's some more information. So it's important to understand the impact of our sex negative culture is that we are, as a society, these are the messages that our society gives people that live in it about sex, that sexual behavior is risky, it's dangerous, it's difficult to control. There's a very small range of acceptable sexual practices, and communication about sex is restricted. Living in a country where we have a sex negative culture, what we know when we look at countries that do not have sex negative cultures, like a lot of the Scandinavian countries, very different in how they handle. They have more of a sex positive culture where there's not a lot of shame associated with sex. They have lower rates of sexual offending. So it's interesting to look at that dynamic. But these are some of the things that we learn as we grow up and move into the world about people that sexually offend, that they're all the same, and that reoffending is inevitable, that once you do it, you're going to do it again, and that treatment doesn't work. And these assumptions come from working with adult sex offenders. These do not apply to children at all. Wow, sorry about that. I didn't realize. What do we know about children and youth who exhibit sexual behavior problems? They can present with these types of diagnoses. I've seen them all of these diagnoses. And I've even seen paraphilia disorder or pedophilic disorder. And yikes is right, because a lot of people diagnose kids with these disorders when you really can't, because these are adult mental disorders. So you shouldn't see a 14-year-old kid with a pedophilic disorder. You cannot diagnose them with that. You have to be 18. And most likely, these kids have a history of some type of developmental trauma. There's been some trauma that's happened in their life. More about what we know. Virtually every study tells us that most youth who have been charged or adjudicated of a sexual offense will not become adult sex offenders. I say that 5,000 times, they will not. Although rates vary, juveniles, the reported recidivism is between 3 and 10%, with a global average of 5. I read a study a couple weeks ago, and it said it was 6% in the country. So that's it. That's youth that have been adjudicated of a sex crime. Only 6% of those youth reoffended. That's low. That's low. So we already know that a child who commits a sexual behavior, who has a sexual behavior problem, or commits a sex crime is already at a low risk to reoffend, just by the nature of the population. And children under 12, even lower. 3% is the estimated average. What we used to believe about adolescents with problematic sexual behavior, we know is not correct. What we did was, as a society, when we started to see this behavior in children and teens, we just adopted adult treatment protocols, adult treatment philosophies, and they were not correct. And what we've done over the last 20, 25 years is done a lot of research to help us know that we weren't doing it the right way. I believe that's all. Label. Sorry.
That's really important, because I think that people assume about the reoffending piece.
Yes, they absolutely just assume that once they do it, they're going to do it again.
Right, and that's some of the fears that families have. So
absolutely, it's a fear, and I often I have worked with lots of foster parents over the years, and quite a few have said, in the beginning, I didn't want to accept a kid that had a sexual behavior. I was just like, no, I put no to sex offenders on my form with the agency. And I was like, oh, why? Well, because they're pedophiles, and they're gonna grow up and they're gonna sexually offend and be on the registry, and I don't want that in my family. And I was like, no, that's really not true. And I've had parents come back and say, like, working with these kids, it was a joy, because A, I knew no one wanted to work with them, and B, they really wanted help and they wanted to get better. It wasn't as difficult as I thought. So I encourage foster parents to try to look to accept kids that have a sexual behavior problem history. It can be very rewarding. These are some terms that we just talked about. Sex offender is a legal term. So unless the child or youth has been convicted of a sex crime, we should not be using that term. And I don't even like to use it on the youth that I work with that are on probation for committing a sex crime. Sex offender, it just, it says adult pedophile, right? That's what I think when I think of sex offender. I don't think of a 14-year-old kid that was sexually traumatized for 5 years of his life and then acted out. I don't, so we need to do a better as society on labeling. So the preferred term is children or youth with a sexual behavior problem or problematic sexual behavior. It is extremely rare for a child or youth to be predatory or have deviant sexual arousal patterns. Those are some of the things that are there in adult sex offenders. They're predatory, they seek to find and victimize, and then they have sexual arousal patterns of having sex with children. Most kids that I've worked with, this is not the case. I mean, I've probably worked with 2 kids and they were older adolescents, and I've been doing this for 25 years. So it's very atypical that someone would have predatory or deviant arousal pattern. Okay. Did I answer that question? I think so.
Yes.
So that's the answer to the next question.
Okay. Let me just remind folks here at this point that we do have the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. So if anybody has a question, please type it in and we will let Kelly know. Thank you.
Yeah.
So in terms of creating safety in a home for the child and for others, what type of information would you give to families?
Okay, I have quite a bit, so I'm going to try to handle it. So I have important, when you have a child that has some sexual behavior, whether it's just some behavior that they're doing to maybe some public masturbation, or one of the caregivers reports they've been touching themselves, or they tried to touch my breast when we were reading a book. It's important to understand that you're going to have, you could have kids that just have behaviors that are to themselves, or you could have kids that are acting out on other children. So providing set, clear, consistent boundaries is important. Enforcing household privacy, bathroom behavior, and affection, and enforce. It's important that you explain what these are in your house. Like, we don't go into a door that's shut in our house unless we knock and listen, or you can come in first, right? So you may have to describe and actually role model and practice these behaviors with the kid, because they may come from a home where maybe they didn't have doors, right? Or they just didn't have privacy. Privacy wasn't part of their family culture. So it's important that you teach them these things, because you could just say, well, we knock when we go into a door. You may need to go further and really, really explain what that means to them. Teach the child how to ask for appropriate affection and role model it with others. And don't forget to ask them for permission too. That's one of the big ways we can teach kids, is we role model. So don't expect them to give people hugs if you're telling them don't hug other people, right? So just make sure that if they need a hug, just say, all you have to do is ask me. You don't come up and grab it, you just ask, right? You ask me for a hug and I'll give you one. Frame the child's inappropriate sexual behavior as a touching problem, not label the child. I mean, I've had people call 7-year-old sex offenders. I'm like, no, you can't do that. That's not true. Helping the child identify when they are beginning to experience trigger feelings and assisting them in developing alternative coping strategies. So if you know that your child really has a hard time with the word no, and they don't handle disappointment well, once you realize that, you may be able to predict situations in which there may be some sexual behavior, especially if their sexual behavior is part of how they soothe themselves. So when they get really mad and they can't regulate their emotions, they may kind of revert to some sexual touching, and you can help them say, okay, how are you feeling right now? You're angry, you're disappointed. I said no, that you couldn't do that. So what are we gonna do? And help them kind of process and work through that, instead of just waiting for the behavior to happen and then correcting them. Try to prevent it. Provide the child with appropriate social activities to decrease feelings of loneliness and increase self-esteem and the mastery of social skills. I cannot tell you how many foster parents really struggle because they understood the safety plan to say they can't do this and they can't do this and they can't do that, so they sit home all the time. That's not true. Like, they can join a group sport. They just have to have supervision, right? They have to understand what the people that are providing the supervision to the child have to understand the child's supervision needs. So you just talk with them. They don't need to be alone with other kids. They shouldn't be helping them get dressed or bathe or, going into the bathroom with them. And you can set up kind of protection so that everybody can get what they need and the kid can participate in the activity. Always use anatomically correct body parts, no slang terms. If a kid is using a word like, let's say, I'm supposed to say dick, if they're saying dick all the time, then you say, no, we don't say that, we say penis. That's what it's called. We say penis, and if you don't want to say penis, then we can say private part, male private part down there. We don't let them use slang terms. That, kind of adds to the mystery when you use slang terms. So we always want to say, I always say an elbow is an elbow and a vagina is a vagina. That's just what it's called, right? There's no secret to it. Cooperate with the therapist and be involved in therapy. I always tell foster parents, don't be having your kid walk into the therapy office and the door shut and you never go in and talk. You should be involved in the therapy. There should be sessions just for you, and then there should be sessions with you and the child. Give the child opportunities to experience unconditional love, family rituals, celebrations, family group activities, making them feel part of something, because a lot of sexual behavior comes out of isolation. And if they feel less isolated, there's less need for the sexual behavior. And supervise. Lots of supervision. Can never go wrong with supervision. Make sure you have a copy of the agreed upon safety plan and you review the status of the plan every opportunity. Request reading materials from your child's therapist or the agency that you work with relevant to the child's behavior. There's lots of stuff out there, and I actually have a resource list at the end that we can share. Keep a journal of your child's experience in your home. That's really super important to know what's going on and what's happening, because sometimes we forget how things happen, especially if there has been some problematic sexual behavior with coercion and force. You want to make sure that you're keeping aware of how they're getting along with other people in the home. So if there's any red flags. Mainstream the child's behavior. This means treat it not any different than any other problematic behavior. It's not worse because it's sexual. It's not. It's not any, if a child has a history of taking a knife and trying to stab people, it's we're not going to say one's worse than the other. It's a behavior that they have, right? It's not who they are. Support groups for caregivers can be helpful. So if you work for an agency, you can maybe ask, are there any other parents that are parenting children with problematic sexual behaviors? Maybe we could do a separate support group for us. Request respite or short-term care and additional support if you become overwhelmed with meeting the needs of the children. Supervision of these children is difficult because it's all the time, right? That's the most difficult thing I think about working with these kids, is that you have to provide them with a high level of supervision. So the child should not be in any home where there's younger children unless somebody has said that they have participated in treatment and they're farther along where they can be in a home with younger children. Recommend that the child, the youth, should have their own room and set clear expectation for privacy rules. Children should not engage in caretaking activities with younger children, such as bathing, toileting, changing diapers, dressing, even babysitting for a minute.
Kelly, I've got a question for you, and maybe
Sure.
this gets answered later, but do you have recommendations of how you can share information about a child's needs with other people, like coaches and teachers who might be supervising the child, but maybe you don't want to share all of their personal information?
Right. Yes, I have that asked all the time. It is not necessary. Like, say if you want your child to play softball, and they do have a sexual behavior problem. Maybe they sexually touched a younger foster child in their first foster home. Nobody knew they had sexual behaviors. That happens because we know that kids get placed without always knowing their history. Or we also know when kids get placed, behaviors can emerge during placement. But you want the child to play softball and they're very interested. Say they're 9, but you don't want to go and tell the coach because you don't know the coach that well. Could be a stranger, right? But you also want to ensure, right, that there is safety. So what you can do is just ask lots of questions about how practice is set up, about how they do games that are away. And you could just say, based on some of the things that happened to so-and-so when they were younger, we provide lots of supervision. So we don't let them be alone with other children. And you just be really general. And if they kind of push it, it's up to the foster parent how they feel appropriate based upon the child's history of behavior. Like if they're really super compulsive about their sexual touching of others, that's probably something you need to talk with the coach about privately and have a conversation and make sure that team is the right fit and that coach is the right fit so that they understand, because there may be a situation which you need to tell them about the behavior, but a lot of the situations you typically don't. You just need to be there. Like I had a foster parent and she would go and she would sit there every practice and watch her child play have basketball practice. And every game she was there. When practice was over, he wouldn't go into the locker room. He would come home with her. Right? Nobody ever knew what was going on, but the child was able to successfully participate in the sports that way.
In your experience, have you had coaches or teachers or school systems deny kids opportunities to do things because they have their own concerns, whether that's because you shared information or because they've observed things?
Well, in Virginia, if the child is involved in the juvenile court, immediately, if they're charged with a sex crime, unfortunately, they are removed from their home school and placed in alternative school. If there's no alternative school available, I just had one kid in a rural part of the state I'm doing an evaluation on, and he's homeschooled now till all the court's over. It's unfortunate that that's kind of the way that we're handling these kids, but a lot of them are immediately shipped off to alternative school. So it's been, for the most part, I would say probably 95% of the time, when we explain to the school or to the recreational coach what's going on, they are very amenable and they understand. I've gone into schools before with kids that are have pretty significant compulsive behavior and done training with the staff, done training with the teachers, arranged for the child to have their own bathroom where they went to the bathroom in the teacher's bathroom instead of the kid's bathroom, because there was some risk there to the sexual touching of others. And these are kids that are not on probation, because if they're not on probation, they have to provide the service in the school to them. They can't deny it.
Okay, thank you.
So supervision and safety planning. It's important that you know where your child is at all times, unless their safety, unless their safety plan allows it. You should know where they are. Knowing the child's friends, having them spend time at the home prior to allowing the friend's child to come over. I've had that similar question to the one that Jeannie asked about coaches. It's the same thing with friends, right? With like parents of kids' friends. How much do you share? Well, getting to know the kid is important, because when you get to know the friend of your child, are there any younger kids in the home? Are there any younger kids that frequent that home? Are there grandparents that bring their grandkids there? Are there situations in which they may be exposed to other younger children that I don't know about? So it's important that you get that information so you know how you can provide the best supervision to the child. And allowing time at the friend's house is something that would happen down the line after you kind of know the environment. Learn about their friends, we talked about that. Wrestle, tickling, engaging in excessive physical contact with younger children really should be limited, and especially in the beginning, because until we really understand, what activates the child's sexual behavior, we won't know how to handle it. Some kids, they feel more sexual when there's lots of physical contact, because that's kind of, maybe that's part of the way that they were groomed when they were sexually abused, or that was the culture in their home. So it's super important that we just manage this in a very healthy way. We're not saying that we don't want kids to engage in physical contact with others. It's just we want to monitor it and be aware of it. The safety plan should always be in writing. I've had foster parents tell me they have safety plans, but they don't have it in writing. It needs to be in writing. And anybody involved with them should have a copy of it. Teachers, if appropriate. Not every teacher needs to know what's going on with the kid. It really depends, and that's typically a treatment team decision where you guys kind of get together and you say, the teacher needs to know this, yes, or the teacher doesn't need to know this. The safety plan should be specific and set clear guidelines for supervision and safety of others as a priority. We talked about the bathroom. Sometimes kids can't use the bathroom. They need to go to the adult bathroom. Sitting on the school bus can sometimes be an issue. Lots of kids, unfortunately, have sexual behaviors and have experienced sexual behavior on a school bus. So it's important that you talk about seating on the school bus. They should sit in the front where they can be seen at all times and have a bus monitor. This also protects the kid too. They're up front, anything going on in the back, which could be considered normal, typical sexual development in kids, some horseplay, they won't be involved in, because it may trigger them. Large group activities, have the child sit near the teacher or the staff person, and provide the child with privacy if they have to change clothes at school. Monitoring online activity. I always get lots of questions about this. Like, what do I do? How do I do it? There's apps. There's so many different apps that parents can download to monitor online activity. I I always make sure that if you're getting an app and you're purchasing it, that it is one of the big monitors is the browser history, and also browser history delete. So it's going to tell you if the kid's going in there and deleting their browser history. That's a big sign it's happening, right? If they're going in there and deleting their browser history, you won't know where they've looked. Talk about online privacy and what it looks like and what it's not, and that sharing anything online is not private. Even if you're doing it, do you know what I mean? Like through Messenger or Instagram DM, that none of that's private. But kids think that, honestly, the younger kids think that it's not private. No oversharing. We talk about this where parents, sharing stuff on social media about their foster child and what they did and what they not did. Have good boundaries online too, so the kids can have that model. Monitor how they're using their cell phone. Find the phone features, have them on, parental control activated. The best thing that you can do is randomly spot check their devices. That is the best way. When they least expect it, check, like I said. I have teenagers. Sometimes I'll reach in the back seat, I grab their phone and say, oh, you know what I mean? If we're driving or sitting at a stoplight, I monitor it when they least expect it so that they know I'm going to be checking. So this kind of talks about the next question, the types of services available to the youth. I did want to say that if you work with a child that's placed in your home, these are things that your private agency or your DSS social worker should be doing for you. They should be advocating for appropriate evaluation if it's necessary for the child, referring the child for appropriate treatment, monitoring their progress in treatment, and access training and monitoring of the caregiver or the teacher on issues relevant and supervision of the child. So they should be supporting you in your supervision of this child and any questions. And if they don't know the answer, they should be getting it. They should understand the safety plan. They should review it with you, especially if there is one at placement, so that everybody understands it. They should monitor your compliance of it, the teacher's compliance of it, and they should communicate with the therapist about issues related to compliance. So how do you know if the child that's placed in your home needs a psychosexual evaluation? I really get this question a lot. So here is definitive kind of bullets about when we would do a psychosexual on a kid. So the agency responsible for investigating allegations of sexual abuse determined that the behavior occurred and substantiated it. So that would be Child Protective Services or the police. That the child has been appropriately investigated and that there is evidence that the behavior has occurred. If an adolescent is adjudicated in court on a sex offense, they order one. If the sexually abusive behavior was directly observed by a reliable, responsible source, or the youth admits to having engaged in sexually abusive behavior. So if any of these things exist, an evaluation may be appropriate. So here's some things that they do. The evaluation can give you an estimate of risk based on available tools and clinical opinion, but the estimate is time limited. So if a child has a psychosexual a year ago, it's no longer valid. You can read it and get information, but it's not a valid risk assessment because risk changes as kids grow. The evaluation can give recommendations for treatment planning, things to focus on in treatment, supervision, and placement. The evaluation can also help you understand protective factors that will assist the child in healing. And those are the good things about the kid, that we help nurture and grow so that we can kind of push the risk factors down. What psychosexual evaluations can't do? They cannot tell you if a child will sexually act out. I've received calls from social workers saying that the foster parent wants to adopt the kid, but because they were sexually abused, they want a psychosexual to make sure they won't sexually act out. That's not the way it works, and we can't predict that at all. We can't. The evaluation cannot predict if a child will sexually act out again. So if you have a kid that comes to you and they have a history and they've done it before, a psychosexual evaluation isn't going to say, yes, the kid's going to do this again, or the kid's not going to do that again. We estimate risk. That's all we can do, is say there's this low risk, moderate risk, high risk that the child will do it again, but we can't say they will. The evaluation cannot tell you if the child will be a pedophile as an adult. I've actually been asked that question. The foster parent did not want to adopt the child because they were afraid they were going to be a pedophile as an adult because they sexually acted out as a child, and the social worker said, oh, we'll get a psychosexual. That's not going to tell us that at all. Protective factors, I mentioned this, but these are things that we want to elevate the most when working with kids with sexual behavior problems. You see the things on this list that they're not, besides healthy sexual attitudes, they're not sexual things, right? These kids need the same things that other kids that have experienced trauma need. They need good emotional regulation and problem solving. They need to trust. They need to have intimacy skills, compassion. They absolutely need to be involved and rewarding involvement in school activities. And I say rewarding, and I say this in a most respectful way, is that if the child is not, a lot of parents think taking a child to church is, that's an activity. That's their activity. But for the child, they may not see that as rewarding. So we need to make sure that we're looking at activities for kids, that we give them a broad range of options, right? Church is awesome and it's great for kids, but they may also want to do something else. So look beyond church sometimes for involving kids in school in activities that they're interested in. Positive about self and hopeful for the future, those are really big things. Like kids that feel good about themselves and feel that their future is hopeful and they're not going to lead a life of crime or be no good. That's what you really want, and you want to help kids feel that way and instill that in them. Resilient personality traits, insight, independence. That's supposed to say initiative. Sorry about my typo. Connectivity, creativity, and humor. So these are things we want to elevate. Working with all people, therapists are not equal. And I say this just to highlight the fact that being a certified sex offender treatment provider, when the state just started certifying individuals back in the early 2000s, and so a lot of people were grandfathered in. They did not get the requisite training that is involved now in being credentialed. So we're left with some sex offender treatment providers that really never got the training to begin with. So it's very important that you just understand that they're not all created equal. The most important thing is that they have current relevant training and they're trained in the developmental age of your child, because a person that's trained to work with teens may not have the expertise to work with the younger kids, or vice versa. Same thing with adults. If they are a certified sex offender treatment provider, but they primarily treat adults, that doesn't mean they can treat adolescents. They have to have specialized training. If the therapist is not a sex offender treatment provider, they should be under supervision as a trainee to be one. And ask them directly, just say directly to the therapist, do you have experience working with kids with problematic sexual behavior? I've had foster parents say, well, they told me that they work with kids with sexual abuse. I thought that was the same. It's not the same. Treating sexual abuse victims is not the same as treating kids that have problematic sexual behavior. Now, a kid may be a sexual abuse victim and also have sexually acting out behavior at the same time, but the treatment is very different. What do you expect from treatment? Individualized treatment plans. They should focus on protective factors, and it should link back to the assessment if one was completed. Safety planning should happen at the first session if there isn't already one. The one thing I always say about safety planning is that the safety plan for the child should evolve as the child moves through treatment. So them not being able to be alone with someone their age, if that's part of their safety plan, at some point, if they're moving towards completion of treatment, that safety plan item should be removed, and they should be able to be alone with a peer. So it's important that we understand that children heal from sexual behavior problems. Treatment isn't needed forever. They don't have to go to therapy for 25 years. We used to think that, but we know now that that's not true. Treatment can be billed to insurance, if individual and family, or intensive in-home. Group therapy is tricky for this population, so if the child is getting group therapy, typically there's another funding source. Collaboration and communication should be clear, consistent, and frequent with everybody involved in the child's treatment team. Treatment progress should be evaluated quarterly. It's also really important that we understand that kids with sexual behavior problems don't do well in residential treatment centers. They really don't. They just don't, because part of what's going on with them is isolation. So if a child is unstable and they need residential treatment, it should be to go and get residential treatment and to get stable from a mental health perspective. I am not a fan or proponent of residential treatment for problematic sexual behavior. It's best when the treatment is completed in the community, in a family home or a group home type of environment. So I'm not a fan of RTC for this typical thing. I think RTC should be to stabilize emotionally and behaviorally, but not to treat this type of behavior. But I know that's kind of not where our state is right now. We do have quite a few residential treatment centers that do this. Typically when the kids come out, they need treatment all over again because they didn't really get what they needed in the facility because they're in isolation. They don't get to practice what they learn. And they're also in a facility with, 2, 20, 30, 50 other kids. I mean, that's a highly charged environment for a child with a sexual behavior problem to live with that many other kids. Not a fan of it. So these are the things that we want to have the child to have dealt with before they leave treatment. So they have to have resolved it. So no social isolation, they have good self-regulation skills, they do not have attitudes supportive of abusive behavior, which means they understand why being sexually abusive is wrong. They have healthy sexuality includes sexual self-regulation, which means they understand how to control themselves sexually. The caregiver relationships should be improved, and they should have social and community supports. And you should also talk a lot about non-sexual delinquency, because the one thing we do know about this population for teens is that when a child commits a sex crime and gets convicted of it, they are more likely to commit a non-sexual crime than a sexual crime. So really helping them understand how to avoid other types of delinquency, not just sexual delinquency, is important. Relapse prevention, we really don't call it that anymore, but it's a plan that a child completes while they're in treatment and typically is done at the end of treatment that allows them to live a life that is free of sexually abusive behavior. It's what I call a good life. So the plan should include how they understand what their trigger or activates their poor decision making, not just sexual poor decision making, because we know that sexual behavior isn't the only, the actual sexual behavior isn't the only thing we need to be concerned about. We maybe need concern about impulsivity, or especially substance abuse. If that was a part of their offending, we need to make sure that they're getting substance abuse treatment. So there's a lot of different things that activate the poor sexual decision making, and we need to make sure that those things are in the plan too. So we talk about body changes, like what does your body feel like when you get sexually aroused? What does your body feel like when you get angry? We talk about that. We talk about their thoughts, their feelings, their behaviors, and we develop coping strategies to support healthier choices and a list of connections, people they can count on to support them. And this should all be in writing. How do you know if your child is completed treatment? These things are there. They've replaced the inappropriate behaviors or peers with pro-social peers. They understand about sexual behavior, dating, romance, consent, school involvement. They know how to be successful at school. If the child has sexual interest in children, and they've said that I have sexual fantasies about having sex with children, there should be a specific plan to address that, how you handle the inappropriate sexual thoughts and behaviors, and that contact with therapists should gradually decrease, and you can maintain booster sessions. A lot of parents feel more comfortable with that. Like, can we see you once every 2 months just to check in? That's totally appropriate. So I've listed a bunch of resources. These are the ones that I typically give the families that I work with. The first book isn't specific to working with sexual behavior problems, but I just think it's a wonderful, wonderful book. We give it out to all of our foster parents when they become foster parents with us, because I just think it gives you a context of how your home is what's healing this kid. They may get treatment from an outpatient provider, they may have a caseworker, a clinician, in-home worker, but you, the foster parent, are what helps heal them in your home. It's a pretty powerful thing. And the rest of the resources are specific to working with kids with sexual behavior problems. I really like Stop It Now website. It is a sexual abuse prevention, but it also helps parents, supports parents who have kids with sexual behavior problems. And all of these can be found on Amazon. Just Google Amazon can help you get those books if you're interested. And the other thing I'll say to all the foster parents listening, first of all, thank you for being foster parents, because I don't know that I could be a foster parent. So thank you for committing to this. It's a mission for sure. And the other thing is, I just encourage you, when you're looking at placing a child with a problematic sexual behavior, try not to pay too much attention if you get a psychosexual evaluation and read it. I've even told some parents, nah, don't read it. I know they're going to give it to you because they need to give it to you, but don't read it. Here's what you do. The first session with a child's therapist, ask them to explain it to you, because there's going to be a lot of language and data and stuff in that report that isn't going to make a lot of sense to you, and it can scare you. So I say, just ask the treatment provider to help you understand what this assessment means and what it says.
Okay, and with that, we are going to wrap up today's event, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.